when we gave our lives to Jesus Christ, we should look and act different. I think we all kind of assume that, don't we? There should be something about us that makes us different from those who don't follow Jesus Christ. Following Jesus Christ, and I'm just going to put it out there, it should make our lives better. Because it should make us better at doing life. Unfortunately, for so many of us who claim to follow Jesus Christ, there seems to be no difference. Anger, jealousy, hurt. We struggle with learning and trying to figure out how to survive life. And instead, we should be the ones who are the most at thriving at life. Knowing Jesus Christ should make us better at doing life. In fact, Peter, what we've been looking at, reminds us that when we gave our lives to Jesus Christ, He gave us everything we need to live life successfully. Now, He stops and says, you've been given everything. You have all you need. Now you need to cultivate what you have been given. And he begins to say, and so we're going to look at this. We're going to start real quickly from 2 Peter chapter 1. We're going to go into verses 5 and 6. He begins to say, now there's some things you need to cultivate. You've been given these things. They are yours to succeed in life, but you're going to have to cultivate them. And he says this, in view of all this, and the in view of all this is going back to verse 4, which talks about He has given you everything you need to live a successful life. In view of all this, make every effort to respond to God's promises. And I'm going to just change that word supplement to cultivate, because I think it's a better word. I like the idea, because He's already given it to us if we will cultivate it. So he goes on to say, cultivate your faith with these generous provisions of these things, or cultivate these things in your life. And here's what we do. Moral excellence. And we talked about that. Moral excellence is the idea of courage, knowledge, self-control, patient endurance. And with patient endurance, godliness. All right, now, okay. As we begin to read this, so far we're going, yeah, I probably do need to be a little more patient. Yes, I probably need to continue to cultivate some courage. I probably need to cultivate some more self-control. But godliness? You ever read something like this and go, yep, I got it. And yet we don't know what we got? When we read about this idea of godliness, we simply assume that it means what? Act like God. That kind of makes sense, right? We read something like this and we go, yeah, I got it. It means we're supposed to act like God. But the problem is that everything he's been saying is the idea of how to act like God. So why would he kind of, in a sense, repeat himself? Is there more to this than simply telling us we need to act like God? Now, part of the thing is this. We tend to read things today, and we read them in our culture of how we understand words. Yet, the reality is what they actually are referring to a different culture meant something different. By the way, I want to go back to Paul real quickly. Paul tells young Timothy the same idea. Paul and Timothy, in fact, as you go through Scripture, the whole New Testament deals with this idea that we need to add godliness to our faith. I like what Paul says, and we're going to get back to it, but Paul told Timothy, a young pastor, he says, physical training is good. Get out there, do some running. Pump a little iron. It's all good. Good for you. But training for godliness is much better, promising benefits in this life and in the life to come. Both Peter and Paul taught us that godliness was essential to live a successful, thriving life. Yet if we assume that the idea of living a godly life is simply acting like God, we've got a little bit of a problem, because both Peter and Paul were writing to a young church that had different ideas of God. Let me kind of explain. When the early church was founded, the early church started off predominantly with a group of Jewish people. The Jewish people assumed, and they took on this idea that godliness was to do what? Do you remember? Old Testament law? To fulfill the law. If the idea of godliness was to act like God, then the idea that Peter and Paul would be encouraging was to continue in the realm of the Old Testament law, because that is how they understood God. But we also know that that cannot be, because Paul came along and said, guys, you have this messed up. God has completed the law. He's finished the law. Add to that confusion as the early church began to expand beyond the gates of Jerusalem and out of the city, or out of the nation of Judah, or the area of Judah. They began to get Greek people come in. They began to incorporate the Italians or the Romans. They began to the barbarians. In fact, from every part of the Roman Empire, the ideas of gods, and there were more gods, by the way. Whenever you would have went through Rome, there were more gods than they could count. If you went into a little suburb that was mostly a certain nationality, that you would have probably come across their gods in their street in little grottos and little shrines all over the place. Their idea of what it meant to be godly was a little bit different than the idea of the Jewish people, who were coming from an idea of Judaism, of circumcision and not eating certain kinds of meat and remembering the Sabbath. I mean, it was just a completely different concept. So, if Paul was talking about the idea of acting like the Jewish God, he would have had to stop and explain to the new Gentiles what this Jewish God looked and acted like. And he doesn't do it. He obviously did not want them to act like the Gentile gods. They were petty and cruel. And yet as they write, he writes as if they all understood what it meant to be godly. The idea of godly, in fact, if we begin to look it up, has to deal with an idea that it didn't matter whether you were Jew or Greek or Italian or barbarian. And by the way, barbarian doesn't mean what we mean today either. It was also a nationality from a different area. They all understood the idea, and the concept did not mean to act like God. It meant, let's see, do I have that up there? It has to do with the idea of being devoted to the point of worship. Okay, let me help you out with this. The idea of godliness is an internal thing, not an external thing. There is something within us that has to change our mindset. As Peter begins to look at us and says, God has given you everything that you need to succeed. Now add to your faith these things. He's beginning to say you're needing to get control of your mind, and you need to get your control of your mind so that it is devoted to God. There were Christians who were godly. There were Jewish people who were godly. There were non-saved people who were godly, and it wasn't a matter because it wasn't about God. It was the idea of devotion. What Paul is telling them, were they like God as we understand? No, but that's not what he's telling them. He stops and he says, and to your faith, you need to be so devoted it leads you to worship. There is an internal battle that we all face. I face it. you face it. We can act one thing and think something different. Do you ever find yourself coming to church on Sunday morning and everything looks good? You look around and don't we assume certain things about people who we're sitting beside? They've got their act together. They're so sweet and they're so kind. They're the nicest people I've ever met. And then if you talk to their wife, their husband, they're going, I don't know what you're talking about because that's not the guy I know. We know it's easy to put on an act, don't we? When you're at the right place at the right time, you can be anything you want to be. You can be a Saints fan at the right place at the right time. But a true Saints fan is not the one who's there when they're winning, is it? I'm just asking Amy because there's a moment that there's a battle that goes on. The idea of being godly is an internal battle that does not have to do with who you worship or who you're acting like. It has to do with who, in a sense, this act of devotion. He's already telling them his divine power. The God that you have put your faith and trust in, the one who came to earth to die for your sin, who rose again after 3 days. When you gave your life to him, he gave you everything. Now you need to have your devotion on him. But why would he be doing that? I mean, didn't they just make a commitment to him? Yeah. Here's the thing that we find out. We can say one thing and live out and act out and think out something different. I want to kind of just go back. The Apostle Paul, who wrote to Timothy, hey, bodily exercise, it's good for you, but remember to exercise godliness or to exercise devotion that leads to worship is more profitable. We know which God he's talking about. He doesn't say, hey, you need to go back to the Jewish God. He's not saying that. Jesus Christ, the one who came, who was God in man, who came, the one we worship. You need to have a devotion to him that is internal, because here's this. There is a battle that wars within all of us. Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. Now, if you've been around for a while, you probably have heard of the letters of 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and you might even be familiar with some of the stuff that was going on that caused Paul to write these letters. The Corinthian church were a group of people who did not act very much like a church. When they got together, they would fight with each other over who they were going to follow. Some would say, we're only going to follow Peter. Some were saying, no, we only want to follow Paul. Some were going, no, we're really spiritual. We only follow the teachings of Jesus. And Paul stops and he says, Jesus is not divided. Peter and Paul are not fighting against each other. We're here to lead you into a relationship. They began to get to a place where they began to take each other to court over certain things. They just fought with each other constantly. They got to the point where they would come and they would do the Lord's Supper or communion. And they would get drunk at communion. They would go and okay, I'm not going to go into everything. Let's just put it this way. When you read through the book of Corinthians, it was so bad that literally if you and I were looking at it today, you would say, this cannot be true. You guys cannot be a church. You are not acting like one. And Paul does not act, he stops and he says this. I want to go to, lost my spot. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, Paul stops and he says, the battle that we're facing is not simply an external battle. There's a battle that's going on, and it's not about how you're acting. Yes, it is showing itself by how you're acting, but it goes deeper than. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, he tells them, for we demolish arguments and every presentation or pretension that sets itself against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to be Christ. Paul begins to tell them there's a battle that goes on. It goes deeper. The actions that we live are based upon not who we say we worship, but who we actually worship. Now, I'm going to mess Dave up a little bit because I actually threw his verses out of order, but I want to go back. The problem with this is the battle we face is that we can claim to be Christian or we can claim to be godly, and yet we can go the other direction because the opposite of godliness is worldliness. Okay. But what does it mean to be worldly? I mean, does it mean to act like the world? If you come Wednesday night, by the way, here's my shameless plug for Wednesday night and home groups, our life groups. We'll talk a bit about this a bit more on Wednesday night. But he begins to stop and he says the opposite of godliness is worldliness. And worldliness is not simply acting like the world because the world itself, I mean, some people act good, some people don't act good. Which part of the world? It has to do with this idea, and I want to go to the book of 1 John real quickly. So Dave, I'm going to mess you up something fierce. But he begins to go back, and so let's go back a little bit, and he begins to talk about this idea of what it means in the battle that we're facing. He says this: for the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see, and a pride in our achievements and possessions. These are not from the Father, but are from the world. We can claim one thing and act another. The idea of the opposite of being fully devoted to God is being fully devoted to self. The cravings for pleasure, cravings for the thing we see, cravings that dump into our pride. Worldliness is what comes naturally. There are so many people who claim to be godly, yet their actions portray or their devotion goes a different direction. Their act of worship is not to God, the one who died for us, but their act of devotion goes to the one who thinks they're the most important. That is self. So as Peter and Paul look at us, they begin to tell us that godliness will lead to something that helps us thrive. And by the way, when you act out on worldliness, your cravings for your flesh, the cravings and the things that you see, and the things that dump into your pride, where does it lead you if you allow it full access to your life? If you act out on your cravings, where does it lead? Probably prison. Let's just be honest. You see, there's the idea of who we are devoted to. Godliness and worldliness is a battle that rages within all of us, even those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ. How do we cultivate an attitude of godliness? How do you stop and change the battle that rages in your mind? Because here's the thing, most of us learn how to battle or try to control our worldliness. Most of us are not concerned with necessarily how do we become more godly, how do we become more devoted to Him. Most of us get to a point of how do we learn how to control our cravings. How do we stop and how do we promote and how do we push godliness? Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I can't fully, totally answer that but we're going to try. How do we stop and say, God, how can I get my mind off of my desires, my cravings, and onto a place of devotion that leads to worship? I'm going to do three things this morning. I'm going to throw out three simple questions that I need you to not simply answer, but I need you to own them. Okay, what do I mean by that? There is a place where we can answer something off the top of our head. It's a little bit like for those of you who ever taught Sunday school. When you ever ask a child in Sunday school a question, you can always raise your hand and answer one thing. It doesn't matter what it is, and it doesn't mean anything, but you know you always have the right answer because the right answer is always Jesus. Thank you, Maya. You see, we know this, don't we? The problem is to know the answer coming off of our tongue versus that which comes out of our hearts are two totally different things. So this morning, what I want to do is, as we start to try to understand godliness, how do we begin to cultivate or develop godliness? I want to give you three questions that I don't want you to simply answer. I want you to own it. I want you to stop and really say, I know the answer, and I know you know the answers, but I want you to own the answers. All right. First question to help us begin to cultivate godliness is I simply want to ask this. If you want to cultivate godliness, you've got to answer this question. From where did I come? Where do I come from? If you're going to begin to cultivate godliness, if you're going to begin to stop and get your place to a place of devotion where you will worship, you have got to answer this question. Where are you from? Where am I from? Your source to that question begins to help you lead your life to who you will worship. As a follower of Jesus Christ, I accept and I just automatically say this. I am from the mind and the action of God himself. I'm from his mind. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he said, I think it would be better if that earth had a man on it. And he created man, and he looked at it and he said, oh, he's incomplete by himself. I better make a woman so that he can, because he's going to make a mess of it. Where did we come from? I'm a direct part of his thought process and his action. I like what John says. In John chapter 1, verse 4, as he begins to explain Jesus coming into the world, he says this about Jesus. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. In other words, from his very thought, he is the beginning. The simple action, the simple answer begins to change who you are devoted to. If God is not your starting point, your act of devotion will go to who or where or what begins your starting point. Number two, if you're going to develop devotion in your life towards God, and by the way, I'm going to explain it more Wednesday night. You got to come Wednesday night. We're going to try to get this deeper. Number two, let's just go on. Number one, answer the question. Don't just answer it by saying, I'm from God. I need you to own the answer. Where are you from? Number two, what is my purpose? Not okay. Not the thing that jumps around in the water. And what is my purpose? Once again, here's the problem. We know this answer. If you've been in church any time at all, you know this answer. If you've been at Milestone for more than a week, you know the answer. Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 39, and Jesus replies, a guy came and says, Jesus, I need you. Help me out. Explain to me what is the greatest thing in the world. What's the greatest commandment? Okay, you know the answer already, don't you? Jesus responds to him. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. You see, we can own that answer, or we can know that answer. You see, this morning, how you begin to answer this question is where you begin to put your devotion. If God is not your beginning, your purpose changes. If you're going to thrive in your life, if you're going to get to a place where you're not simply surviving, but you are thriving, Peter tells us you need some devotion that leads to a place of worship. This is not an action, but an attitude that controls us. The problem is this is where worldliness comes in. And even those of us who claim to follow Jesus Christ, we begin to say that our purpose is, we love God and we love others. But the truth is that when we begin to live it out, the place and the act of devotion goes back to ourselves. It's not about knowing the answer. It's about owning the answer. I want to go to one more. Where do we come from? Where is our purpose? If we're going to get to a place of devotion that leads to worship, I'm going to ask you one other question that we need to own. Now, you know the answer. You've been here long enough. Where's our end? Where do I end? Once it is done, what happens next? Your life and my life is extremely short. If God blesses you with long, good health, you may live to be in your 90s. You may even get to be over 100. But can I just say this? That is very short in the whole scheme of things. What's next? We know this answer. You're in here this morning because you're like I am. We're stopping to say, we know what the answer is, right? As a follower of Jesus Christ, we know the answer off of our tongue. We know it from our head. What's next? Well, let's go to John chapter 14. You guys know this because we say we believe this, don't we? Jesus was talking to his disciples. And he tells them, there is more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, wouldn't I have told you, or would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you so that you will always be with me where I am. For those of us who hold to the promise of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we believe this is just the warm-up. The hope we have as followers of Jesus Christ is that there is something and somewhere better. This is not the end. But can I ask you this question? If we say that our end is to be with God, where should our devotion be at? If we don't just say it, but if we truly own it, the outcome changes. It leads us to a place of devotion. You see, there's a battle going on within you, and there's a battle going on within me. There's two different viewpoints that are trying to gain control. One is godliness, and it's not the idea of simply acting like God. However, if you are truly devoted to something, it just causes you to act different. But it's a mind game. If your mind is truly devoted to a place of worship to the one who died for you, it changes something inside of you. Your other option is that you can allow worldliness, or the idea of the cravings that dwell within us in our flesh, in our physical desires, the cravings that stop because of the things we see, the pride that builds up in our accomplishments and the things that we are and we say and we do. If we allow that to take place, where's your place of devotion? Is it self, or is it the one who died? It's a simple question. With your knowledge should come more self-control. He's already told us that. With the courage you have should come more patience. We know that. But Paul is telling us, or Peter is telling us, that with these things there should begin to be a change in our mind and our attitude. There's a battle that rages within. Who's going to gain first place in your life? Add to your faith godliness, or a devotion that leads to a place of worship. Something that changes your mind, because you're going to battle with yourself that either you are going to be on your throne or you're going to allow God to be on that throne. So, if you're going to thrive, Peter tells us you need to allow God to sit on his throne. You need to get off of it and allow him on it. Father, this morning as we get ready to close, I know there's a battle that goes on that wages a war in my mind every week, every day. A battle not to act godly, but to be godly. To have a devotion towards you that lives itself out in worship. A place that doesn't just know the answers off of my tip of my tongue, but begins to seep its way into my life, that changes the way I think. Who am I devoted to? Where am I from? Why am I here? And where am I going to end up? Lord, I know that battle rages within each and every one of us. It's only natural. It's normal. But Lord, may we get off of your throne and allow you to sit on your throne. May you be our God. Not just from a mental perspective, but from an active worship perspective, where our heart and our minds yearn for you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I want to remind you about house groups this week, or life groups. I don't know if the pastor changed the day of his, but normally you meet on Tuesday. So I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss a memo somewhere along there. So if you show up here on Wednesday night for his group, he will not be here, I don't think. So be here Tuesday night for his group and get all of the extra things that you didn't get this morning. I'm sure it will be great. My group will be on Wednesday nights, and I think we're starting our study of the topic of miracles this week. So if you're interested in any of that, Tuesday and Wednesday night of this week. I hope you enjoy the day that God has given you. And as we started this month of November, which is the greatest month because it's the month of Thanksgiving, I hope you will focus, especially this month, on all that God has done for you and what you have to be grateful for. We will see you back here next time.